Hi, my name is Nicole Martinez, and I am presenting my project for social work. My presentation examines how the United States' involvement in Guatemala represents a pattern of abuse and gaslighting on a global scale. The U.S. positioned itself as a savior of democracy, but acted as an abuser, creating violence, denying responsibility, and then blaming the victims for the harm it caused. This presentation is called The Cycle of Violence and Displacement: U.S. Involvement in Guatemala. Today, I will be discussing how U.S. intervention in Guatemala during the Cold War created a long-lasting social, political, and humanitarian consequences, including forced migration, family separation, and human rights violations that continue today. I will also connect the global human rights principles and ethical responsibilities of social work. In 1954, the CIA orchestrated a coup that overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. His land reforms threatened U.S. corporate interests, especially the United Fruit Company. The U.S. justified the coup under the guise of fighting communism, but it was really about protecting corporate profits. This moment sparked a 36-year civil war during which U.S. support military regimes fueled mass killings, disappearances, and genocides against indigenous Maya communities. What was framed as a defense democracy was, in fact, a defense economic domination. In terms of this situation, I think of it as America as the abuser. If we think about it in the language of a relationship, America acted like an abuser. It created harm, denied responsibility, and blamed Guatemala for its suffering. It destabilized the country, then labeled Guatemalans as illegal for seeking safety. This mirrors an abusive dynamic, minimizing harm and rewriting history to appear as the hero. That's what political gaslighting is, making a nation doubt its own reality. Before the U.S. involvement, most Guatemalans lived in poverty under a system where a small elite and U.S. companies controlled most farmlands. Movement grew out of resistance to this inequality, aiming to bring social justice and land reform. Civil War. After 1954 coup, Guatemala fell into a long civil war that lasted from 1960 to 1996. During this time, the U.S. trained and supported Guatemalan military forces, creating death squads that targeted indigenous communities, students, and anyone that was seen as a threat to U.S. interest. These weren't foreign troops, they were Guatemalans, brown and indigenous people, trained and armed and funded by the U.S. to harm their own people. It created a cycle of violence where communities were forced to destroy themselves under U.S. influence. And then, that decades later, when survivors or their families fled to the U.S. to escape the same violence, they were labeled as the problem. Those who benefited were U.S. corporations like United Fruit, Guatemalan elites, and political leaders who maintained power through fear. The ones who suffered were indigenous and rural populations, people who lost their land, homes, and families. This was not democracy, but corporation disguised as policy. For the Dulles brothers and other, regime change was a family business. For Guatemalans, it was a generational trauma. Social and cultural impacts transitional motherhood. The social impact of this history is still visible today. Indigenous and rural families continue to face poverty, discrimination. One significant outcome is transitional motherhood. When women migrate for safety or work and are forced to leave their children behind, the separation is not abandonment, but survival. These mothers became a symbol of resilience in a world shaped by inequality and violence, showing how the U.S. foreign policy reshaped family life and emotional survival. Human right violations. These events represent clear violations of international human rights. UDHR Article 9 states that no one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. CRC Article 9 says that children should not be separated from their parents. Both of these rights were broken during the Civil War and again through modern U.S. border policies. The same nation that claimed to protect democracy funded massacres and now detains the survivors who flee from them. Structural violence and harmless bombs. U.S. involvement in Guatemala represents structural violence, harm embedded in the policies, budgets, and international systems. The U.S. dropped bombs on indigenous villages and called them harmless. But there is no such thing. Every explosion destroyed homes and families under the illusion of democracy. This wasn't protection, it was violence disguised as virtue. The psychology of gaslighting isn't just personal, it's political. America erased the truth of its own actions and convinced both Guatemalans and U.S. citizens that the violence was justified. By controlling the narrative and denying reality, abusive systems survive, manipulating memory and silencing victims. The social work connection. For social work, understanding this history is essential. When we serve migrants and refugees, we are confronting the collective consequences of systemic abuse. Ethical social work means recognizing how global power structures, including U.S. foreign policy, create conditions people are escaping. Our role is to stop gaslighting survivors' experiences and advocate for policies rooted in dignity, equity, and justice. I've met people whose families have fled from Guatemala during this era. They were not seeking opportunity. They were running for their lives. Learning this history helped me understand their experiences more deeply and see how global events still shape our communities. Migration is not a choice. It is a survivor response to systemic violence. In conclusion, U.S. involvement in Guatemala has caused long-term suffering that continues through migration and inequality today. Women and indigenous families carry that legacy through displacement and sacrifice. Knowing this history helps us approach immigrant families with compassion, understanding, and a commitment to justice. America often paints itself as the hero of every story, but in Guatemala, it was the abuser, inflicting harm, rewriting truth, and blaming the victim. True justice begins with honesty. As social workers and global citizens, we must acknowledge how history connects to today's injustice. Only by recognizing the past can we break the cycle of violence and move toward authentic social justice. Here is my reference page. I used a lot of our articles and videos from social work, In my ethnic studies class, I had learned about transitional motherhood, and I felt that it applied to what I was presenting to the class. Thank you.